Mexico City built itself atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the ancient Aztec capital. Beneath the colonial streets and modern skyscrapers, fragments of that lost civilization still lie hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. In the summer of 2019, a construction crew began demolishing a deteriorating residential building in the historic Centro district, unaware that beneath its concrete foundation lay something that would rewrite local understanding of pre-Columbian sacred sites. What started as routine demolition became an archaeological fever dream. The careful exposure of a limestone altar carved with intricate glyphs, surrounded by offerings that had remained untouched for over 500 years. Among the artifacts were jade skulls so intricately carved they seemed to catch the light like living eyes, and obsidian blades so sharp they could still cut skin. The discovery sparked a race against time, between those who wanted to preserve history and those who saw profit in silence. The story that follows is one of obsession, competing ambitions, and the thin line between plunder and preservation. It is a tale of what lies beneath the city and what men will risk to claim it. Chapter 1. The Collapse. The jackhammer's roar echoed through the empty building on Calle Pino Suarez, a 5-story structure condemned for structural decay. Miguel Rodriguez had been a demolition foreman for 23 years, and he could read a condemned building the way sailors read the sea. This one, built in 1952 on the foundation of something far older, would come down in 3 weeks. Standard job, standard pay. He descended into the basement, boots crunching on loose rubble and dust so thick it hung in the air like fog. The foundation was crumbling, exactly as the engineer's report had predicted. He marked sections for removal with spray paint, moving methodically through the damp darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the murk. That's when the floor gave way. Miguel's right foot plunged through rotted concrete, and for a sickening moment he scrambled for balance. His palm struck something solid, not earth, but something worked, deliberate, carved. He pulled himself back up, heart hammering, and shone his light into the gap. Below the foundation was a chamber. The beam illuminated pale stone, cut and fitted with precision that spoke of ancient hands. His breath caught. Mexican construction sites always turned up fragments, pre-Columbian pottery shards, broken figurines, but this was different. This was intentional architecture, deliberately hidden beneath decades of concrete and debris. Miguel climbed out, his hands trembling slightly. He called his supervisor Carlos, a man more concerned with schedules than history. Carlos arrived 40 minutes later, visibly annoyed, descending the basement stairs with the energy of someone expecting to waste time. When Miguel showed him the carved stone visible through the floor break, Carlos's irritation transformed into something more complex. Calculation. "We don't report this yet," Carlos said quietly. "First, we assess. If this becomes an official archaeological site, the job stops. Work halts. The developer loses money, we lose contracts." Miguel knew what Carlos wasn't saying. What they found in the next few hours could disappear quietly into private collections, pockets worth far more than their salaries. Pre-Columbian artifacts moved fast through Mexico City's shadow market. Collectors paid handsomely for jade, for obsidian, for things that belonged in museums. "I'm calling the Instituto Nacional de Antropología," Miguel said flatly. "This is history." Carlos stepped closer, and for a moment something dangerous flickered across his face. Then it passed. "Think about your wife, your daughter's university tuition. One anonymous call to the wrong collector, and you're comfortable for 5 years. Miguel looked away, back at the carved stone glowing in the basement darkness. He thought about his daughter, yes, but he also thought about what lay beneath their feet, something that had survived 5 centuries of conquest, colonialism, and urban expansion, something that refused to be erased. He pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected to Dr. Gabriela Fuentes at the Instituto, a woman he'd never met but whose name he'd seen in the newspaper 2 years prior, when she'd helped recover looted artifacts from a private collector in Polanco. He reported the location, the building, and the glimpse of carved stone. The line went quiet for 3 seconds. "Don't touch anything," she said, "and don't tell anyone else. I'm coming now." When Gabriela arrived 90 minutes later, she was not what Miguel expected. She was younger than her professorial reputation suggested, perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in a single glance. She descended into the basement with only Miguel and Carlos present. No fanfare, no immediate official machinery. She crouched at the gap in the floor, shining a professional light into the darkness below. The beam caught carved stone and her breath audibly sharpened. "This is ceremonial," she whispered. "Look at the glyphs. This is temple architecture, pre-conquest." She pulled out her phone and photographed the visible stone, then looked up at Carlos. "How long before you demolish this floor?" 2 days, Carlos said, his tone carefully neutral. Gabriela stood, her decision made. "Tomorrow morning I bring a team. You stop all work. This building is now under provisional protection pending a full assessment. I'm invoking Article 28 of the Cultural Heritage Law." Carlos's jaw tightened. The developer won't accept delays. The developer should have commissioned a proper pre-demolition archaeological survey, Gabriela replied coldly. They didn't. That's their liability, not mine. She turned to Miguel. "I need someone who knows the structure, someone I can trust. Are you interested in helping us properly excavate what's underneath?" Miguel glanced at Carlos, who was already walking toward the stairs, his phone to his ear. Calling the developer, no doubt. The decision crystallized. "I'll be here tomorrow at 7, Miguel said. As Gabriela climbed the basement stairs, she turned back once. Whatever's down there has waited 500 years to be found. It can wait one more night. But we need to move fast before someone less scrupulous than your foreman decides to profit from the silence." That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He thought about the carved stone, about what might lie beneath, about the choices that divided men into those who preserved history and those who erased it for profit. He didn't know yet that his choice would lead him into a deeper mystery, one involving a family curse, a rival collector, and a truth about what the Aztecs had buried so carefully that it remained hidden even from the conquistadors who took everything else. But by dawn, when he returned to the building, nothing would ever be simple again. Chapter 2. The excavation begins. Gabriela's team arrived before sunrise, a careful choreography of controlled urgency. There were 3 of them besides her: Luis, a structural engineer who moved with the deliberation of someone accustomed to working in spaces where a single misstep could be fatal; Petra, a conservation specialist whose job was to stabilize artifacts immediately upon exposure; and Roberto, a graduate student with shaking hands and barely suppressed excitement, seeing his first major excavation. They set up portable lights and established a careful perimeter around the floor breach. The basement smelled of age, not decay, but the mineral silence of sealed spaces undisturbed for centuries. Miguel watched from above as Luis assessed the structural integrity, determining what could be safely removed without collapsing the floor entirely. "We need to cut through this concrete carefully," Luis explained, moving with his palm over the fractured edge. "Below that is likely fill dirt, probably dumped during the Spanish colonial period to level the site. Once we breach that, we'll find the chamber." By mid-morning, they'd cleared enough to see the chamber's scope. It wasn't large, perhaps 4 meters across, 3 meters deep, but it was undeniably intact. The carved limestone walls bore glyphs that Gabriela photographed obsessively, calling them out to Roberto, who documented everything in a leather journal with an old-fashioned reverence that made Miguel smile, despite the tension radiating from everyone else. "Dedicatory glyphs," Gabriela murmured, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Look at this motif. This is consistent with early Aztec calendar notation. We're looking at something from the 14th, maybe 15th century. Pre-conquest, certainly. This was sealed before the Spanish ever reached the city." As they carefully removed soil from the chamber floor, the first artifact emerged, a jade figurine, no larger than a fist, carved into the shape of a bird. Petra cleaned away the soil gently, her hands moving with museum-trained precision, and held it to the light. The jade was a luminous green, almost glowing in the basement gloom. This quality of jade would have come from Guatemala, Gabriela said softly. The Aztecs traded extensively for it. It was more precious than gold to them. By afternoon, they'd exposed the altar itself, a limestone block perhaps 2 meters long, carved with an elaborate scene showing figures in ceremonial dress facing what appeared to be a calendar wheel, and arranged in front of the altar were the offerings. The jade skulls emerged first. 3 of them, each roughly the size of a man's fist, carved with such anatomical precision that they bore individual characteristics, one with a severe expression, one appearing almost serene, one with an expression of anguish that seemed impossible to render in stone. The jade was translucent in places, catching the light and seeming to contain interior glow. Then came the obsidian. The blades lay in careful arrangement on what had once been a woven mat, now reduced to carbonized shadow. Each blade was between 10 and 30 centimeters long, many still maintaining an edge that made Petra handling them with absolute care, wrapped in cloth despite their age. These were ritual blades, Gabriela said, her voice reverent, possibly used in ceremonial bloodletting, or, she paused, studying the arrangement, offered as weapons to a deity. The arrangement suggests intentional placement. This wasn't random burial. This was a ritual cache. It was Roberto who noticed the stone box. Beneath the altar, partially hidden by accumulated soil, was a limestone vessel no larger than a shoebox, carved from a single piece and fitted with a sealed lid. The carving on its surface depicted a skeletal face, the death god Mictlantecutli in characteristic pose. "Don't open it yet," Gabriela commanded. "We need to photograph it in place first. This arrangement, the positioning, everything matters. Roberto, sketch it. Luis, photograph every angle. Petra, we'll need climate control the moment we move it. This chamber has maintained its environment for 500 years. We don't expose it to air and humidity without preparation." It was during this careful documentation that they heard the sound from above. Footsteps, multiple people, moving through the building with purposeful speed. Miguel recognized the voice immediately. Carlos, the supervisor, along with someone else. A man speaking rapid Spanish with an accent Miguel couldn't immediately place. A collector's accent. The kind that promised money and discretion. Gabriela's head snapped up, meeting Miguel's eyes. Without words, he understood. They'd moved too slowly. Word had reached someone who saw opportunity rather than history. Chapter 3. The Rival. The man descending the basement stairs wore a linen suit despite the Mexico City heat, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His name, he announced to Gabriela, was Alejandro Castillo, and he represented a private collector from Monterrey who had a significant interest in pre-Columbian artifacts of museum quality. "I'm authorizing you to cease work immediately," Castillo said smoothly, producing a document from his jacket pocket. "My client has purchased the property from the developer. All archaeological findings now fall under private jurisdiction." Gabriela didn't even glance at the paper. "That's not how Mexican cultural law works, and you know it. Any artifact discovered on this soil is property of the state, held in trust for the Mexican people. Private property rights end at the boundary of heritage law." Castillo smiled, the expression containing no warmth. "Heritage law is subject to interpretation. My client's interpretation, backed by his very expensive lawyers, differs from yours." "Your client is a known looter," Gabriela said coldly. "I've documented 6 separate acquisitions through your hands in the past 3 years, all stolen, all violations of the UNESCO Convention. I have no doubt you're involved in this." "Allegations require proof," Castillo replied, "and proof requires cooperation from authorities who have other priorities. Drug cartels, corruption investigations, human trafficking. Do you think archaeologists rank high on Mexico City's police agenda?" The silence that followed was absolute. Castillo's implication hung in the basement air like poisoned smoke, that the legal system could be navigated, delayed, corrupted. That bureaucracy could be weaponized against preservation just as easily as for it. "We have documentation," Roberto said suddenly. his young voice sharp with fear and defiance. "Every artifact has been photographed in situ. GPS coordinates, digital records backed to cloud servers. If you remove anything, we have evidence." Castillo barely glanced at him. A graduate student's word, against established collectors' credentials and the presumption of legal purchase? I wouldn't risk your career on that wager, young man. But something shifted in his expression as he looked at the artifacts arranged before him. The jade skulls seemed to capture him entirely, his gaze fixed on them with an intensity that transcended commercial interest. For just a moment, something genuine broke through his practiced charm. "They're remarkable," he said quietly. "I understand why you fight for them." Then the moment passed, and the businessmen returned. "I'm giving you 12 hours to remove your equipment and personnel. After that, the building is secured and my client's experts begin proper cataloging." "I'm calling the federal police," Gabriella said flatly, "and the federal attorney for environmental protection. You're welcome to wait while that process unfolds. Might be months." Castillo actually laughed. "Do it. Meanwhile, I ensure that certain details about how you conducted this excavation without proper permits reach the right people. You didn't file preliminary notifications, you didn't get formal authorization. You began excavation based on a single report from a construction worker. How rigorous is that, Dr. Fuentes? How will it look in a courtroom when my lawyers argue that your entire chain of custody is compromised?" He adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture contemptuous. 12 hours. He left, Carlos trailing behind him like a smaller planet orbiting a larger one. The silence persisted. "He's right about the permits," Luis said quietly. "We moved fast. Technically, we're vulnerable." "So what do we do?" Roberto asked, looking between them with the desperate hope of someone seeking a solution that didn't involve defeat. Gabriella was staring at the limestone box beneath the altar, the death god's face carved into its surface, patient and implacable. "We open it," she said, "now. Before they come back with lawyers and security and corporate injunctions. We document everything immediately, and then we move the artifacts somewhere safe." "Is that legal?" Roberto asked. "No," Gabriella said. "But neither is what they're planning to do. Sometimes the only way to fight institutional corruption is to operate outside the institutions for exactly long enough to make them irrelevant." She looked at Miguel. "I need your help. All of you. If you're interested in saving this history, the real work starts now. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from." Chapter 4. The Hidden Message. They worked through the night with focused urgency, their hands moving with practiced care despite the pressure building with each passing hour. Petra carefully removed the obsidian blades one by one, wrapping each in archival paper and placing them in reinforced containers. Roberto photographed everything obsessively, his camera flashing like lightning in the basement gloom, creating a complete digital archive that would survive regardless of what happened in the physical world. But the limestone box remained sealed. It took them 2 hours just to safely extract it from beneath the altar. The chamber's seal had held so completely that roots had never penetrated. Fungi had never colonized the stone. The box emerged into the modern air like something from a dream, impossibly preserved, its carved surface still sharp enough to cut hands on its edges. The lid was fitted so precisely that it took Luis and Miguel working together to carefully pry it open without damage, using only wooden wedges and infinite patience. Gabriella stood beside them, her entire body rigid with controlled excitement and fear. When the lid finally lifted, the smell that emerged was not decay but something else. A dry mineral scent like the air from sealed caves, untouched by time's corruption. Inside, wrapped in layers of what had once been paper but was now fragile as moth wings, lay a series of obsidian tablets, but not decorative tablets. These were thin sheets covered entirely with glyphs, hundreds of them, arranged in careful rows, a text in stone. "It's a codex," Gabriella whispered. "A written document. They preserved it in obsidian instead of the traditional paper because obsidian is eternal. They knew it would last forever." Roberto began photographing each tablet in sequence, his hands shaking so badly that Luis had to steady his camera. The glyphs were identical to those used in known pre-Columbian manuscripts, but the context was entirely new to any of them. "There," Gabriella said, pointing to a sequence repeated across multiple tablets. "That glyph represents one rabbit, a calendar date, and that one is the name glyph for a ruler, I think. I think this is a historical account, written in stone, hidden deliberately." Miguel studied the glyphs, unable to read them but unable to look away. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate, methodical, like a message from one era trying to reach another across centuries of conquest and forgetting. "Why hide it?" Roberto asked. "Why not carve it on a temple wall where people would see it?" "Because someone didn't want it seen," Gabriella said grimly. "Look at the date. One rabbit corresponds to 1527 in the Christian calendar. That's just 6 years after the Spanish conquest. Someone in Tenochtitlan was recording history that the new rulers didn't want recorded. She was photographing the tablets with her phone now, understanding completely that they might never see these originals again after the night ended. They were preserving testimony, creating a counter-narrative, an Aztec account of what happened during the conquest, recorded in stone and hidden in a sealed chamber, betting that someday someone would find it. A sound from above made them all freeze. Voices, footsteps, the building suddenly alive with movement. "They're coming back," Luis said tersely. "Move the box," Gabriella commanded. "Get it to Roberto's vehicle. Move everything, now." What followed was controlled chaos. Roberto ran upstairs to bring his car to the basement loading entrance. Technically impossible, but Roberto managed it, driving down the narrow stairs with reckless speed. The others worked in efficient silence, loading containers, equipment, and documents into the vehicle's trunk and back seat. Miguel was carrying the last container of obsidian blades when he heard Carlos's voice from the upper floor, shouting something about authorities arriving. But Gabriella was already outside, already moving. They left the building with 3 minutes to spare before the police arrived. Not Carlos's private security, but actual federal police, called by a competing faction that remained invisible to them, but whose interests aligned with preservation over profit. Later, Miguel would learn that Dr. Fuentes had contacts throughout the government, people who remembered when artifacts mattered, when history was worth fighting for. They'd called in favors, they'd made promises. The anonymous tip about a possible smuggling operation had triggered the official response exactly when they needed it. But in the moment, driving through Mexico City's pre-dawn streets, loaded with archaeological treasures in a graduate student's battered Volkswagen, Miguel understood that they'd crossed a line. From this point forward, they were committed. The artifacts existed now in duplicate, documented digitally but also physically real and requiring protection. "Where are we going?" Roberto asked, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "Somewhere no one will look," Gabriella said quietly. "Somewhere the past is still sacred." Chapter 5. The Decipherment. The place Gabriella took them was a small museum in Coyoacán, hidden in a colonial mansion that looked abandoned but possessed the kind of security that emerged only when absolutely needed. The director, an elderly woman named Dr. Aurora Reyes, embraced Gabriella like a sister and asked no questions about the origins of their cargo. "We have a conservation lab," Aurora said simply. "It's climate-controlled, secure, whatever you need." Over the next 3 days, as Castillo's lawyers sent increasingly threatening letters to every governmental agency they could reach, the Obsidian tablets were carefully documented. A paleographer named Dr. Martin Sanchez, called in from the National University, began the painstaking work of translation. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that he emerged from the laboratory, exhausted but triumphant. "It's a testimony," he said, setting the photographs of the tablets on the table. "A record left by a scribe named Topoltocton, personal assistant to Montezuma II. He was recording the history of the conquest from the Aztec perspective, something that was completely suppressed during the colonial period. Every Spanish account was the only history allowed to survive." He began reading passages aloud, his voice carrying the weight of words that had waited 5 centuries to be heard. The strangers came in their floating mountains, and we did not recognize them as men at first. They brought fire that spoke, and horses we had never seen, and sickness that moved faster than arrows. Montezuma believed the prophecy, that Quetzalcoatl had returned. But I knew it was not true. They were men, and men could be fought. We could have won if we had fought from the beginning. The words hung in the air, not historical dry fact, but the actual voice of someone who had witnessed the end of a civilization, trying desperately to preserve the truth. There's more, Dr. Sanchez continued. He describes a treasure hidden before the Spanish took the city. Not gold. They took that. But knowledge. Sacred objects. A record of Aztec cosmology and ritual that the conquerors would have destroyed entirely. He writes that he hid these things and sealed the chamber, hoping that in the time of the resurrection, when the Aztec nation would remember itself, the testimony would be found. He left it for us, Roberto said softly. 500 years ago, he left this message for us. Gabriela was silent, staring at the obsidian tablets catching the morning light. Which means we have a responsibility. This isn't just archaeology. This is a direct communication across centuries. A man protecting his people's memory against erasure. It was Miguel who asked the difficult question. What happens now? They'll keep fighting us, Castillo. The developer, everyone who saw profit in silence. Gabriela looked at him with something like respect. Now we make it impossible to keep quiet. Roberto submits his academic paper. Dr. Sanchez publishes his translation. We hold a public exhibition. We place these artifacts in the National Museum under federal protection. We make Topoltocton's testimony so publicly available, so completely documented that trying to suppress it becomes the story instead. They'll have grounds to say we violated procedures, Luis warned. Yes, Gabriela agreed. But the violation of hiding a historical treasure is infinitely greater than the violation of discovering it. Some rules exist to protect institutions. Others exist to protect truth. When they conflict, there's only one ethical choice. It was during this conversation that Miguel's phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him. The voice on the line was Alejandro Castillo's. I'm calling to withdraw our claim, Castillo said simply. I've advised my client that the publicity surrounding these artifacts makes them essentially valueless to a collector. They've become too well known, too documented. He's releasing all legal claims. Why? Miguel asked. There was a long pause. Because I read Dr. Sanchez's translation. Because I understood that some things cannot be owned. Because Topoltocton deserved better than to have his words disappear into a private collection. Another pause. And because I have a daughter, and I thought about what I was willing to steal from her world. He hung up. Gabriela took the phone from Miguel's hand, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she smiled. Not the professional smile of an academic, but something genuine and weary and full of hard-won hope. We won, she said. The hard part now is making sure we don't lose it again. Chapter 6. The Resurrection. The exhibition opened on a cold December morning at the National Museum of Anthropology, in a gallery that had been hastily renovated to accommodate the most significant Aztec discovery in decades. The limestone altar was positioned as the centerpiece, surrounded by the jade skulls and obsidian blades arranged exactly as they had been found. The obsidian tablets, protected behind museum-grade glass, gleamed like captured darkness. But the most powerful display was the testimony itself, Topoltocton's words, translated into Spanish, English, and the indigenous languages of Mexico, printed on gold-leafed panels surrounding the artifacts. I write these words knowing they may never be read, but I write them anyway, because memory is the only weapon that cannot be confiscated by conquest. I write for the time when my people remember themselves. I write because Tenochtitlan will rise again, not as a city of stone, but as a city of memory and truth. Miguel stood before the display with Gabriela, Roberto, and Aurora, watching the crowds move through the gallery, families with children, elderly people who had never known this history existed, scholars taking photographs and making notes, Young Mexicans standing before the jade skulls and touching their own faces, recognizing something ancestral. He was right, Roberto said softly. Tenochtitlan is rising again, not as a political power but as a voice that cannot be silenced. Castillo appeared toward the end of the day, moving through the exhibition with quiet respect. He paused before each artifact, and when he reached Topoltocton's words, he read them entirely, his lips moving silently. When he turned, Gabriela approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't do it for thanks," Castillo replied. "I did it because I was reminded that some treasures have value beyond money, that some things are worth preserving even when they diminish us personally." He produced a document from his jacket. "My client is establishing a foundation, a fund for archaeological preservation. We'll never recover what was stolen, but we can protect what remains." He left the museum without another word. That night, in a small restaurant near the museum, the original team gathered: Miguel, Gabriela, Roberto, Luis, Petra, Dr. Sanchez, Aurora, and, surprisingly, Carlos, who had quit his job with the developer months earlier, unable to live with what he'd nearly enabled. They ordered traditional dishes and drank mezcal, and no one mentioned the discovery directly. Instead, they talked about other things, about football, about families, about the future. But underneath the conversation ran the profound understanding that they had participated in something larger than themselves. It was Miguel who finally spoke to it. "My daughter got her university tuition," he said quietly. "Not from that money Carlos was offering. I worked extra jobs, but she's studying archaeology now. She came to the museum opening and she saw those artifacts, and she decided she wanted to preserve history instead of just building buildings." He paused, looking around the table. Topoltocton wanted his words to reach the future. They did. Not in the way he imagined, but they did. His testimony changed a collector's mind. It sent a young graduate student down a career path. It started a preservation foundation. It gave my daughter a future she didn't know she wanted. "That's what Topoltocton understood," Gabriela said. "That truth doesn't just exist in a moment. It ripples across centuries. One man, 500 years ago, decided to preserve testimony, knowing he might never see the consequences. And because he did that, we're sitting here, and the Obsidian tablets still exist, and his words are being taught to schoolchildren." "He won," Roberto said. "The conquistadors thought they'd silence the Aztec voice forever, but Topoltocton proved them wrong. He proved that truth has a half-life measured in centuries, not years, that you can bury testimony but you can't destroy it forever." Luis raised his glass. "To Topoltocton, to the scribe who refused to let his people be erased." They drank. Later, standing outside the restaurant, looking back toward the illuminated museum building, Miguel thought about the basement floor that had given way beneath his boot. He thought about the choice he'd made in that moment, to report rather than profit, to preserve rather than plunder. He thought about how small, individual choices ripple forward through time, how a single decision to do the right thing connects across centuries to touch people who hadn't been born yet. Topoltocton had made his choice 500 years earlier. Miguel had made his choice months ago. Now his daughter would make her own choices about preservation and truth. And somewhere in a future neither of them could imagine, someone else would make a choice that honored both of them. This was history, not as monuments and museums, but as choices made by ordinary people deciding what mattered enough to fight for. This was how civilizations actually survived, not through conquest or power, but through individuals who refused to let the truth disappear. The jade skull still glowed in their museum cases, carrying light from beyond 5 centuries of darkness. The obsidian tablets, inscribed with testimony, still held the words of a man determined that his people would not be forgotten. And in the basement where this story began, a sealed chamber lay empty now, but the world above had been changed by what emerged from it. Tenochtitlan had risen again, not as a city of pyramids and temples, but as a voice speaking across time, refusing to be silenced, demanding to be remembered. And that, Miguel understood, was a kind of victory far greater than any treasure buried in the earth. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.